on?
Welcome everybody to Learning with Syeyutsus. This is our 5th season. Learning with Syeyutsus is part of the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools efforts to implement Call to Action 57, where we're learning as much as we possibly can about Indigenous peoples and histories and languages and understandings of how to be in the world. We're doing this in relationship with the UBC Press and with our relatives at the Vancouver Island Regional Libraries, and we thank them both for being such great partners in the work that we do together. As always, I will turn it over to our relative Tom Quatten to welcome us to the Hul'qumi'num speaking territories here on the west coast of what's now called Canada. To you, my brother.
Nuanyoch Ziet tes Nanemoch Mistayoch te Stiminus te Snavnawas Wilmoch Atanaquelit Umaxquel Heil he look to Squallow and Lamnach was Tennessee Amnesia Nancy and Chelsey Zapka Quasi other Inamet see Emna Schwatlaka and it's a Flachent to Skakip Stultitlam Atanaquel and so needs up total at the themas Zapka. Really in a great feeling of acknowledgement and thankfulness to our land-related relatives in Snuneymuch and Minas and Stepnalis for opening up their arms and opening up their doors so we can learn these things. And our dearest respected relations, Chelsey and Nancy, for being here. I'm going to start off by blessing our gathering and sharing a song to start us off in a good way so we can go deeper in here and less out of here as much as we can. So Zapka Siyam Nasiya Zapka. Siyam Taught Mustimo Osh Tamach Zapka Zapka. Rimu he looked to squallowinst needs quackwanatun a quail. Heichka to ait met squail. Heichka to heil ait met tamach. Eat umaxdemi at na quail to max squail. Needs up that huimetat nawa amastal akut ait squallowin. T'echwam eats o tal at that Ita salitst. T'echwam huilas metal. To mark tanashwala qua needs up imish at a house squale. Heichka quats twa tanatamach at tanaquelit to max squale. Nawach squamquams at a salitst. Heichka. Oh, 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 eh. Exactly.
Gracias. When we first started on this journey in the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, and we were initially learning about what we meant through the Syeyutsus work, one of the stories that we were told by Auntie Joan Brown talked about it starts with land. It starts with land and being in a reciprocal relationship with land. And how do we pay back all of the gifts that land gives us? And one of the statements she gave us was to imagine if you loved the land as much as the land loved you. And so I'm quite excited about today's session, particularly because I've known Dr. Nancy Turner for a long time, and I've learned so much from her, and she shared the knowledge that she's learned so much from the people of this land with all of us in such a gentle and beautiful way. And also a new friend, Dr. Chelsey Geralda Armstrong, who's doing some amazing work learning from the land and from the peoples and all of the things that cover the land up in our Tsimshian and Gitxsan relatives just up the coast from us. And so I'm so pleased to welcome you both to share the knowledge and the trips that you've made on this professional and personal journeys in learning from the land and showing an example for us here in the school district, but also for all of the people who live on these territories of how to be in a reciprocal relationship with the land, and also to learn a little bit about how our ancestors exhibited that reciprocal relationship and how it still shows itself today. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Nancy Turner and Dr. Chelsey Geralda Armstrong to our session today. So welcome to you both, and we're so pleased to have you.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and Stephanie. Thank you, Tzumkwalton, for your beautiful introduction to the work that we're doing, and to be here with my friend Chelsey is a real pleasure. And we're really happy to be able to share some of our experiences and the things that we've learned from the land and from the people over the years. Chelsey's going to use the slideshow, and Chelsey, please go ahead and introduce yourself if you like, or say a few words.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Chelsey. I'm calling from Kitsillas, Tsimshian, Lachiap up here in Terrace, BC, and I'm more of an archaeologist and historical ecologist, but I had the pleasure of having Nancy as my mentor throughout my graduate career and now into my work up north. She's still kind of the guiding light for a lot of us. And so yeah, this is really honestly so nice to just be able to hang out with you all today with her. I feel pretty honored. Nancy, do you want to remind me if you're blue or am I blue?
You're blue and I'm green.
Okay. That will make
we have a
sense to
little
you all.
symbol for both of us talking together.
Okay.
So
Yeah, so of course, I think it is important to recognize not just the places where we're currently residing, but all of unceded territories in BC, all places where we're doing our work, living. And so yeah, I think that will come to the fore in a lot of what we talk about today, but for you all just to also consider where you're hanging out and what you can do to support territory owners there.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I'm here on Protection Island in the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw people, Coast Salish people, and I'm so grateful to them, the people today and their ancestors both, for all looking after and caring for this place. I'll let you change the slides, Chelsey.
Yeah, so just a quick acknowledgement. I mean, some of the stuff we're going to talk about today is in the book that's in the nice background heading of Stephanie and Ted's windows there. So this is called Silm Da'axk, which is based on a lot of knowledge of some of the people in this list here. I mean, we could list them all off, but Bossy Bolton, Bert Bryant, Alfie McDames, Ruth Reese, Mary West Johnson was a big part of this. Lucille Seymour's recently passed away. She was a big part of this. But I also want to hand it over to Nancy to kind of thank all the
Thanks.
people she's worked with.
Thank you, Chelsey. Could you change the slide?
Oh, there we go.
I can.
Are you guys seeing it?
I can only see the title slide.
Yeah.
Oh no. Oh no, guys, I'm so sorry. I have been changing it, but it's not, I guess it's not working.
You have two screens going?
I don't.
Okay.
There we go.
Oh, there, you did it.
So I had to zip out of we can just keep it like this then maybe? Okay. So okay, well that makes a lot more sense to you guys now. So sorry about that. You missed out on a beautiful Rosa Nutkana and some Saskatoons and salmon berries there. Okay, and then we're going down. There you are, Nancy.
Thank you so much. The photo of Dr. Margaret Sywallis from the Newhalk Nation brings back so many memories, and there's so many people. They're listed here, but only a few of the people who have been my teachers and friends for so many generations since I started working in this area of ethnoecology back in the 1960s. So thank you. I raise my hands to all of these folks, and we'll be talking about some of them as we go through. Thanks, Chelsey. We thank you, the organizers, our good friends, for inviting us to come and share this knowledge with you. And we have many friends and colleagues who have shared our learning journeys as well. Dr. Dana Lepofsky, Dr. Douglas Doerr, and many others we'll mention by name as we go through. So today...
Okay, so, oh, sorry, Nancy.
That's all right.
I keep mixing up the triangles. You go ahead.
Not to worry. I just, this is the plan for our talk today. Our conversation will be, we've already introduced ourselves a little, and I will start with a little story about my first introduction to forest gardens, and then Chelsey will talk about her work. And then we'll just have a kind of a wrap-up session at the end. We hope to take about 40 minutes or so and leave some time for questions at the end.
This I just snuck in for those of you that might not be familiar with the North or the Northwest, Northern Northwest, I should say. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different places, communities, territories, but I just wanted to call attention to where I'll be talking about a lot of my work, which is in Gitzlas territory here. This is kind of a large polygon of all Tsimshian nations, but Gitzlas in there. I also work with a number of Giksan Huwilp or Wilp house groups that I'll talk about kind of around the town of Hazelton and into the Upper Skeena watershed. And then we also do a lot of work in Wet'suwet'en territory, which includes kind of the southern Skeena River subbasins. And I'll mention a bit of our work in Cheollis and in Mowachat and Wichilat country.
Okay, so that's my my signal there to talk a little bit or to tell you a story. Really, in 2008, some time ago now, I went with our good friend Dr. Jim McDonald, who's since passed away, and a group of other friends, including my friend Adosti Judy Thompson, Dr. Nancy Mackin, Ken Downs, Clint Marshall, Chief Don Roberts from the Kitsum-Kalem Nation, and Stephanie Forsyth. We went with Jim to a place that he had worked in and studied and worked with people about, called Robintown. It has its own name as well in the Kitsum-Kalem area, but it was known as Robintown because it had a history and a story, a creation story that goes with it, that the town was once occupied by robins. And it's fun because on our trip there, we hiked through the birch forest and we found a shell of a robin's egg right there. Then we went, I think the next slide, Chelsey. We went to a place that I was astounded to see because there were so many culturally important plants, all growing together right on this ancient village site. I couldn't believe my eyes. There was a crabapple tree that had been lopped over at the top so that people could pick the crabapples from the upper part of the tree. There was high bush cranberry there. There was, of course, birch. There was hazelnut, red elderberry. I mentioned hazelnut, stinging nettle, rice root, wild ginger, all of these plants that I knew from working with elders and learning from them have great cultural importance. But here they were, all growing on the different terraces along this village site, along the river. And that's when I started to realize people were actually cultivating these plants. This was a forest garden. Next slide, Chelsey.
Yeah, and so I guess to kind of continue that story, when I started my graduate work with Dana Lepovsky, and Nancy, we contacted Jim, and Jim said, yeah, come look at this hazelnut. And so I went to Robintown, which is down here in the right corner, is an aerial shot of the forest garden of Dalth Gyalekya was the name. And this pattern was really remarkable, as Nancy says, but then just kind of hanging out in terrace and talking to other Tsimshan who were said, yeah, well, come to my village. Like, we've got the same thing. And so I went to the Kitsalis Canyon with Darren Bolton here and another colleague named CJ Nabas, who is a council person with Kitsalis. And they said, come to Kitsalis Canyon. And sure enough, it was almost an identical pattern. And so I started doing kind of more concerted inventories and again, just getting called to different places like, hey, I think we have that. So this is in Syeyutsus territory on the Harrison River. That's Morgan Ritchie, who's an archaeologist and has done a lot of awesome work. And, these hazelnuts are growing 15 meters. I mean, they're just massive, massive, massive. And then even on the coast, this is an apple orchard, which certainly forms part of the forest garden landscape. And with, lots of salmon berries in the understory. And then do we know what tree this is? For if there's any botanists in the crowd, this is Malus fusca. This is a Pacific crabapple, but here they grow. They have diameters of 60 centimeters. They grow huge. It's like an oak meadow. It really is like an oak meadow. Those are all apples in the background too, on a place called Apple Island in Nuchatlet territory. So this pattern is reoccurring across, the Pacific Northwest and certainly in other areas. And it's really kind of underscoring what I think a lot of Indigenous folks always knew, but what researchers are only starting to really catch up with.
That seems to be the story all along with clam gardens and all kinds of other um, ways that people had of looking after their lands and the species that they rely on. So we'll just focus a little bit on the different species that we've mentioned, starting with the molluks or crabapple. Small little apples, but they grow in clusters, and they are very, very important as a traditional food, very nutritious, and people would harvest them in the late summer and early fall and store them underwater, and they get softer and sweeter as they were stored in cedarwood boxes.
Yeah, and our dear friend Leslie Main Johnson has in the 90s she started noticing a pattern with milks in Giksan territories where Pacific crabapple it tends to grow on the coast. It's a coastal species, but it's growing further inland than we would expect. And Leslie found this pattern that it's the further you go inland, it's more associated with village sites.
Yeah.
And so this is something, another pattern we see reoccurring down south as well. And it's an iconic indicator of people.
Thanks, Chelsey. And not only that, but working with the Gitcat Nation at Hartley Bay, with Marjorie Hill and some of the other knowledge keepers of the past decades, we learned that there's not just one kind of crabapple, but there are 6 or 7 different varieties that people knew and grew and looked after, and they each had their own particular ways of preparing them and using them. And one of our students, Victoria Wiley de Echeverria, did her master's work on the molluks and the different varieties. So there's the scum molluks, the real crab apples, Molluks gigawa, the crow's crab apples, gasasi, the long legs, and buchos, the dice box. All of those are different varieties that people knew where to go to get them, and they ripened at different times and had a bit of a different flavor.
Hazelnut is another indicator species that I'm terribly interested in because of Nancy. Again, just starting my research when I was younger, she said you really have to look at the hazelnut. And that was, again, some work that I ended up doing with Jim McDonald before he passed. Hazelnut is really the Swiss Army knife of the plant world. It's used for all sorts of things. You like the food, of course. It's a very relatively easy to harvest and you don't have to do a lot of processing for it to store over the long term. And so, of course, the food's important. But in our work with Marion Dixon, Chaco, and Elder from Sparzim and Inkakatmach Elder, she talked about the oil being really important as a medicinal constituent. She talked about weaving with the young shoots. The root of hazelnut produces a blue dye, which is like one of the hardest colors to get in nature. So it's just like Swiss Army knife of the plant world. And again, owing to Nancy's kind of exquisite botanical knowledge, we know we had this hunch, Nancy had this hunch, and looking at linguistic indices as well, that it was transplanted long distances, which we'll talk about in a second.
Thanks, Chelsey. Yeah. And then another one of the forest garden species that you see all the time is the red elderberry. And again, this is a really important fruit that you have to cook it to make it really good, but people made sauce from it. I'll never forget eating the red elderberry sauce, alk. They call it in the Belakula language, in the Nuxalk language. You put it on fish, and it's really delicious, nutritious. Elderberry is also used for medicinal purposes in many areas as well. So it's one of that cluster of species that you find over and over again, sometimes along with the blue elderberry as well.
I'll just add quickly to it's one of the most frequently occurring paleoethnobotanical finds. So at archaeological sites,
Right.
this is the seed showing up every time without fail. It's people were consuming a lot of it. Is that me? Yeah. Okay.
That's you.
So scan playa or scan cerepix is high bush cranberry, which again is like all these plants we're mentioning, an indicator species. One elder that we talk about in the book, Amy Bevan, she says it tasted like dirty socks, but it would keep your energy levels up. So this is something that, if you've ever had it, it does have a potent taste, but you really get used to it. It's now maybe one of my favorites to just kind of pick away at in the bush. But we know too from herbalists, it's a really important medicinal plant, cramp bark, right, being important. But again, showing up with people quite frequently and with all those other indicator species at forest gardens. Nancy, do you want to add about the Haida Tsimshan?
Oh, well, just there's a story, a Haida story about how Raven brought the high bush cranberries to Haida Gwaii. And it might reflect to the ancestral practice of bringing plants from one place to another. But the story rings a bell because it's only found in certain locales on Haida Gwaii, and also the name Hlaya is the same as the Tsimshan name Hlaya. So there's some connection there. We're not quite sure of all the details, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if this is one of the ones that long, long ago was brought by people from one place to another. Yeah. Now, I guess that's me, green, the green triangle. Similarly, there's stories about the soapberry, and that's always another very favorite berry that you have to get used to the taste of because it has a slight bitter flavor to it, but it's considered very healthy. And of course, the bitterness is due to the saponins, the soap-like compounds in the berries that cause them to be able to be whipped up into a foam froth that is a very favorite confection to this day. And the names, again, for soapberry indicate communication across languages because you have us and s in Haida as well, from between Giksan and Tsimshian and Haida. And then the Masset Haida name, Hogutlet, is related to the Tlingit name. So you can see the roots of trade and exchange of knowledge across peoples by looking at the names.
And I always say it's kind of doing the reverse of Pacific crabapple. So it's quite common in the interior and a little more spotty on the coast, but where it is on the coast, for example, here in Kitsilus country, they were known, Franz Boas said, oh yeah, they were the soapberry specialists. And there's parts of the territory where it's just the whole forest understory is soapberry, but it doesn't really make sense with the rest of the biogeography of the area. And so we think again that people were very much involved in that distribution.
Although I should point out, Chelsey, that they found remains of soapberry going back maybe that 12,000 years. It's one of the very early species that is found even in the Pleistocene times. So it's had a long and ancient history and connection with people.
Black huckleberry, I mean, you can never have favorites, but if I had to have a favorite, this is, when you think about Giksan and Tsimshian cultivation, this is the first plant that comes to mind. I mean, people were mega producers of black huckleberry. It grows at some semi-higher elevations than most plants, and was cultivated through regular burning, pruning, and of course with some help from our friend the bear. But today there's still really good berry harvesting spots in Giksan territory, and it's because of the burning. We know it was recently burned. And it happens to just be once it's burned, the berries grow big, fat, and juicy. They're hanging off bushes like grapes. This isn't just a kind of couple berries on a bush type thing. You can sit down with your bucket. You don't have to move around with your bucket. You can just sit and pick for so long. So it is also one of the better tasting berries, if I may say so, when it has been burned. Very sweet.
It's definitely a favorite. In some places, it's just called osha, which means berry. It's just the berry. And just to make a comment on Chelsey's note about the fire, people used fire in a very careful, respectful way. They knew what they were doing, and they would burn over areas to create early successional stages where the berries would just thrive, and some of the root vegetables as well. And it's not like the fires that we see these days that have really actually resulted because of climate change, and also that burning, controlled burning by Indigenous peoples was banned back in the early 1900s. So people haven't been able to use fire in the way they did in the past. Chelsey, you go ahead and talk about these.
Yeah, so there's a few here. Nisk Ogo, which is the Giksan word, or Ko'o. Thimbleberry, of course, is very important as an early successional plant. We see it a lot in disturbed areas, but again, at these forest gardens, they're quite prolific. Very tasty, of course. The leaves were used for berry drying racks up in Giksan country. Currants are a great one too. I mean, I find it, Nancy, what do you think? I hear about it more and see them more as a coastal species. You don't, of course, people are using ribes across BC, but definitely on the coast, it's a very important plant.
There are different species that are common on the coast and in the interior, and in the north and in the south. So we have the desert currant up in the interior that people used a lot in the Syeyutsus and other areas of the southern interior. But the gray currant, sometimes called stink currant, which is unfortunate, it does have sort of the tangy odor to it, but a very delicious berry, and found in wetlands all up and down the coast. Another component of the forest garden complex. And then we have the gooseberries as well, which are related, but there's lots of those as well. Okay, Chelsey. I guess bracken fern is another one that people don't use so much these days, but in the past, it was part of the fire complex. After a fire, the bracken fern would grow really well, and people would dig up the long, thick rhizomes, and there's a starchy cortex in amongst the fibers of the bracken fern. They would roast the rhizomes in the fire and then pound them and make a sort of a flour, almost a bread-like consistency with the bracken fern roots, which was a staple food in the old days for many people, but it hasn't been used very much in recent times.
Yeah, this one is interesting to me because I don't hear about it a lot, but when you look at archival and historical texts from, midshipmen on Captain Cook's voyage, they say that, the bracken fern is their bread, like it's just so a day-to-day thing people are eating. It's very common. but probably went out of use with the introduction of flour.
That's exactly it. Not to mention potatoes coming
Yeah.
coming in from the south, maybe pre-European, but nonetheless fairly recent. And so flour and potatoes together, and bannock and all the flour products kind of took over from the bracken. A favorite plant of mine, the wild ginger, has a beautiful fragrance to it, and is used medicinally and as a spiritual plant by many people up and down the coast. And I was so happy to see it there at Robintown, growing along the riverbank there. We didn't have a Tsimshian or Giksan name for it, but I imagine there was one in the past. I imagine people used it, and it seems that people would have transplanted it as well. There was some talk about commercializing the ginger root, and that's always a worry, because once it starts to be harvested commercially, often it's over harvested and people lose out and it's not available anymore. Fortunately, we can find it here and there, and it grows well from rhizomes.
All over Kittilis Canyon.
Can I
Everywhere.
jump in with a quick question for you two?
Yeah.
Okay, this
Sure.
is from Guy. Says that is there evidence of using lomatium? These roots are widely used in the Plateau and Great Basin.
Lomatium, yes, yes. Nancy,
Oh,
do you want
that's
to talk
Lomatium.
about that?
Yeah, there are quite a few species, and they were often called biscuit root because they were used such an important root vegetable, especially for the southern interior peoples. Several different species of them, but one of them is the Coquela root, that is well known in the Shuatmuch and Syeyutsus and other nations. On the coast, we have a couple species, and the one that is the most important in our region here on Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands is called wild celery. It used to be called Indian consumption plant, and it's the seeds, not the root, that are so important and are still very important as a spiritual plant and for ceremonial purposes as well as for medicinal purposes for colds and sore throats. Anything you want to add there, Chelsey?
No, I think that's got, I mean, yeah, in the interior you hear, I mean, Lewis and Clark wrote about it often, about people eating them. So yeah, it was probably very common. Yeah.
You go for it, Chelsey.
Okay, Steti. This is an interesting plant. Kind of globally, it's got a human footprint going on. I mean, it's associated with old homesteads here and in Northern Europe. It's a plant that was thought to perhaps have been introduced, but now I think we know it was very much a native species, commonly used throughout the Northwest. It's in, as you see in the photos here, actually, these are beautiful photos, Nancy, in more in Giksan territory than I know in Tsimshian, where cedar was maybe more common. The stinging nettle was incredibly important as a fiber. And there are some practitioners, even in Kittilis today, that still know how to process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for making fish nets especially,
fish
very,
nets,
very
yes.
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess we need to watch our time a little bit, so.
Oh yeah, we could talk forever, eh?
We could.
Yeah,
It's
stinging
really
nettles
fun.
is a favorite one of mine too. It used to grow outside our house right next to where my dad parked the car, so we were often
yeah.
came in close contact as kids with the stinging nettles.
Yes. Yeah, you learn pretty quickly to stay away from it. Oh, this is a photo back at Robintown there with Ken Downs, our friend Ken Downs, showing the rice root, which Chief Roberts said people brought into Robintown from the coast, the northern rice root, another plant that has kind of a broad northerly distribution and probably was transplanted and brought to different places like Robintown for people to use as a root vegetable.
Yeah, in the Upper Skeena watershed, which is quite far inland relative to the coast, a lot of northern Gitxsan, their ancestral homeland was called Gittin Da'axk, excuse me, people of the rice root. And
Oh,
this is way up in the northern kind of interior of Gitxsan country. And many house groups have rice root as a crust. And so very, very close connections between people in this beautiful, one of, again, my favorites. They're all my favorites.
Mugenget, yeah. And another one, you could talk for hours about this plant, Worms, the Devil's Club.
Yeah, we could, eh? We'll keep going. Oh, this is fun, yeah. So one of their, that's Quaxistella there at a root garden, is that right, Nancy?
That's
It's
that, right, the
Kingham?
Tequilak root garden at Kingham Inlet. Yes.
Wonderful. These are, I mean, these root gardens are so, I mean, they're estuarine, so it's where, you know, fresh water is meeting salt water and creating these beautiful habitats, very diverse. And people were expanding the high marsh zone called the Potentilla trifolium zone, the Pacific silverweed and clover, which is pretty locally constricted in its range, but people were probably expanding that. Do you want to talk about the berry gardens in Camas?
Only that people used to plant berry bushes in particular places. I learned from Cyril Carpenter and Pauline Waterfall from the Heiltsuk Nation, where they had berry gardens along Roscoe Inlet beside waterfalls on south-facing slopes, and they would bury fish guts and other fertilizer around the berry bushes, and they said you could just pick the berries off by the handful, the blueberries, the huckleberries, and other kinds of berries. And so now they've found the Loki Way, the clam gardens, and we found the seaweed places where people actually cultivate the seaweed, and marshy areas. So all of these different complexes that we being European-based academics, assumed were just natural, are actually tended places, tended by humans for millennia. I guess
These
that's
are
just what.
some of the methods, yeah. We can.
So all of these are practices that go with the gardens, with the forest gardens, the berry gardens, how people were so careful. Children were trained from an early age to help and participate and look after these areas. And there was a lot of what Robin Wall Kimmerer would frame as well as reciprocity and gratitude that people pay to the other organisms, the non-human beings that look after us and care for us, and we are obligated to care for them in that way.
I think ownership is another one that's not fully understood, and just how strict some ownership laws are, for example, in Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en country. You know, if you are in charge of a place and you are in charge of that place to make sure it's productive for the next, you know, however many generations. We often hear 7, but it could be a lot. It's just something that I hear often. And so even if you know, the common saying is if you shoot a bear in your territory, it runs into another person's territory, it's no longer your bear. And the same is true for plants when you're working with enhancing the productivity and proclivity of plant foods. That's comes with direct ownership ties as well.
Exactly, and that ownership is inherited. The owner it gets passed on to the next generation in a very formal way, often, so that there's continuous generational caring for any of these places that we're talking about. We talked about transplanting and how people brought roots or fruits from one place to another. And the late Emma Nice told me about her grandmother who was blind, and her grandfather transplanted a lot of different plants into their garden at Gitwinsilk along the Nass River. The elderberry, the huckleberry, the blueberries, the service berries, crab apples, and so on, so that her grandmother could pick those fruits even just outside her door, stinging nettle, all of these things. So that's just one example of oral history that goes with the creation of these beautiful garden areas.
That story sounds like true love.
True love indeed. Yeah.
That's so nice. This is a study that Nancy and I were part of, and kind of stems from Nancy and Jim's work. And it's just a really kind of cool example of transplanting using genetic studies. So this is the contemporary distribution of hazelnut in BC, and Nancy had suggested some linguistic connections between Coast Salish and Tsimshianic language family, so Nishka, Gitsan, and Tsimshian words. And just as a point of interest, I mean, this region of the Skeena, I mean, forest gardens are everywhere. People are managing a lot, and the hazelnut shows that. So this is what's often referred to as a disjunct population. So something that is, removed from a larger distribution. And the rule in biogeography is that anything that's disjunct or isolated should have less genetic diversity. And yet we see the exact opposite. And importantly, associations that are directly related to what, again, people have always known. So this group here in purple is a unique genetic cluster of hazelnut exclusively at Robintown. What Jim and I believe Lucy Hayward was the elder he worked with, who talked a lot about hazelnut and rice root, and what Nancy talked about, they were bang on. The genetics shows this. At Kitsalis Canyon and up on the Nass, actually at Gitwinsilk, where Emma was, the hazelnut is coming from what we call the Shuswap distribution. It's coming from the most kind of southern area you could, when this whole time around the city of Hazelton, named after its hazelnuts, there are hazelnuts there, and yet people are extending relations further south or moving further north. And it's not this kind of rational economics. There's a deeper thing going on here. And I'll just say this is another unique genetic cluster of hazelnuts seen nowhere else at the city of Temlaham, which is another origin city for southern Gitxsan people.
What gave me the idea of people having brought hazelnuts up to the Skeena from the mouth of the Fraser River was the name Thick, which is actually a Proto-Salish name, and the early Salishan people's homeland is at the mouth of the Fraser River. So I sort of thought, oh, well, the Gitxsan and Niska names, Tsik, which also means squirrel, the name for squirrel. It must be that people brought hazelnuts with them from the Fraser River and the name along with them. That was my thought. It turns out it's much more complicated than that.
Which we always love. We love when it's more complicated.
Yeah.
And just very quickly, some of the work I mentioned, I'm primarily an archaeologist and historical ecologist. So, of course, we like to know what's going on above ground, but we also want to look at what's going on with patterns below ground. And the soils tell a really interesting story across these forest garden sites. So this is just an example. This is a profile of Gixech, which is a village forest garden. So this is where the house platforms would have been on the Skeena, and then above on a further terrace is the actual forest garden and processing area. And then, of course, the conifers are encroaching with the cessation of management. But we know from Adao, from stories of people of having to manage their landscapes, you know, what to do with fish, how to bury them, and these sorts of things, that there's a sense of people managing soils. And in fact, that's what we saw. I worked with a soil scientist here from UBC, JT Cornelius, and he analyzed everything you can think of for soil indices, looking at different nutrients, looking at pH levels, ammonium nitrate, exchangeable nutrients, the carbon nitrogen ratio, all these things. And he basically said what we're seeing is akin to something in the Amazon called Amazonian dark earths. He's calling them Tsimshian dark earths. They're these huge deposits of organic black soil, like stuff you'd want to garden with. And in fact, there are some elders who said, oh yeah, I used to steal some of that soil and bring it up to the res to my home garden because they knew it was so good where people were living. And it's not midden at the village site. This is across the larger landscape. People are enhancing the soil processes below ground too. And so again, this is something we know from the Adao, from the oral histories about children and others, you know, not burying their fish, not taking care of the soils, and fish exacting their revenge. So yeah. What have we learned, Nancy? How about you take this one?
Well, we've learned that there's a whole lot of wisdom and underpinning the way people have looked after the land here in British Columbia and beyond. And they must have learned it like when millennia ago, back in at the time of the Pleistocene, observing, watching, testing, looking at what animals do. They see bears when they eat, they leave a few berries scattered around. So they learn to scatter a few berries when you're picking them. You always leave some behind. They saw how the rice root little granules were left behind when the grizzly digs it. And so they knew that they should leave a little bit behind too, or replant some of the parts of the root and they'll grow into new plants, making the tequila root gardens that Quatsistala clan chief Adam Dick talked about and taught us about. So we're still in a steep learning curve, I would say, wouldn't you, Chelsey?
Yes, absolutely.
Just trying to catch up with what the elders have known all along. And what's happened to our lands? What's happened to the berries? Annie York from Spuzzum said it all. Now it turns into bush. That's why we don't get many berries anymore. We're not allowed to burn. And we also see places where all of these different gardens and management methods are available to see for yourselves in one place. And one of those is Hoyat on North Hunter Island in Heiltsuk territory, where there's fish traps, there's clam gardens out, there's the estuarine root gardens, there's culturally modified trees in the village site, stinging nettles taller than people, crabapple trees, everything all together in this one amazing village, ancient village site.
And maybe even closer to home, Nancy, there's some students of ours and Jennifer Grenz at UBC working at the Cowichan Bay Estuary.
Oh, yes.
And that's another one. If you're there at low tide, you can see the fish traps grade into the root gardens, grade into the forest gardens, grade into the camas meadows. I mean, it's just one beautiful transect of land management. And maybe closer to home for you, some of you.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to shout out this book. So this is the, it'll come out in September. There's two versions of this book that we did. So here are some of the elders that contributed to the work. Isabel's looking so sweet there. So we wrote this book together with the Kitsilus Elders Society called the Elderberries. And we put together a community version of the book. So this has a lot of kind of local place-based knowledge, right? It's meant to kind of to revive plant knowledge again. So it's telling folks, okay, you want high bush cranberry, turn left on this road, go up. So of course we didn't want to share that widely, but we did. We do have another public version of the book for you all. And usually I would feel bad kind of highlighting our own work, but the entire profits of the book goes back to the Kitsilano Stewardship Society. It's a 400-page book. Half of it is the historical ecology of the Middle Skeena, and then the other half is this guidebook with quotes directly from elders and talking about management and some of the stuff Nancy and I covered today. So have a look out for that in September.
Can't wait to see it, Chelsey.
Yeah, me
Congratulations.
too.
Yeah,
And some
just,
references.
yeah, just a few references on the work that we've been talking about. So we want to thank you all for your interest, and all of you, Stephanie and Ted, for your
Yeah.
ongoing work in this area. It's just so inspiring for us.
Mm.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
For us too. I just want to thank you two so much for sharing what I know is just a tiny little bit of what you've been taught over the years. I love how you talked about learning from our non-human relatives, those teachers, because that's what Auntie Jonas told us all along, is that you have to slow down enough and be quiet enough and patient enough if you're actually going to learn anything along this way. I've loved learning from, especially from your books too, Nancy, and from our conversations about how to do that and ways of thinking about the land differently than what we've been taught in most of our whole adult lives. And and that now as I go walk through the woods, my eyes are always peeled for our non-human relatives and the medicines that are there and ways to interact with them. I want to thank you so much, both of you, for joining us, and for also all of our audience who I can see are putting up
Yes.
their thank yous on our chat at the moment. So in September, we'll look for Silm Da'axk as it hits the book stands. So it's to you both.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
I
much.
so
saw that you
much.
referenced this
Oh, good. Yeah.
beautiful book in your work, and I just want to say to all our friends who live in Coast Salish territory, this is a must on your reading list.
Those
Right,
James plants. Yep.
I also wanted to comment just how, the language, Chelsey, when you were sharing some of the words in traditional languages, I could hear the land. I could hear the little squirrel in the words. I could hear the blueberry.
Yeah.
And it reminded me too of one of our past speakers in this series, our dear Lindsay Burrows, John Burrows,
Oh,
talking about blueberry pie. I won't even attempt to say that word.
Yeah.
It's a very long
Yeah.
word, but it incorporated the stories of the land and the people. And, yeah, amazing. So, hi, Sepka, my dear friends. Thank you for coming and sharing such wonderful wisdom today.
we enjoyed it. And Chelsey, it's always an honor to present with you and see the work that you're doing. It's really exciting. Congratulations on your book, too.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.